Hello viewers and welcome to this session and program. Today we will discuss on the topic Ecotoxicology. This forms a part of the course MEV-004 Environmental Toxicology, and it forms a part of the program Postgraduate Diploma in Environmental and Occupational Health and Master of Arts in Environmental and Occupational Health. Welcome to this program. Now, people may be surprised to learn that the water that we drink, the air that we breathe, the soil that we use to grow our crops are all contaminated. Now, sometimes they could be contaminated with certain toxic heavy metals. And then this can move in the food chain, and then the human beings, the environmental health can be affected. And so this session is going to talk about the toxic effects that we observe due to these toxic elements which are dispersed into the environment, and the effects that are seen on the ecosystems, on the communities, and also on the human health. So, now, even the natural cases, like for example, even in the case of the volcanic eruptions, even they can also emit certain hazardous or toxic substances. And a classic example is that of the carbon dioxide gas that was released on the night. It was a tragic study on the 21st of August in 1986 in the Lake Cameroon, that is in Africa. Now here we find that a large amount of the carbon dioxide, this was released due to the volcanic vents that were present at the bottom of this lake, and the carbon dioxide then accumulated with time in the bottom water, that is the carbon dioxide saturated bottom waters. And then we find that after some time there was some other kind of a disturbance, and this could have been due to a small earthquake or due to a landslide which occurred, the subaqueous landslide which occurred, and we found that this gas started moving upward and it also got dispersed into the atmosphere. And then since the gas is heavier than air, it also was found in the nearby villages where it was deposited, and several of the plant and the animal species were affected, and 1700 human beings were also asphyxiated due to inhaling this toxic carbon dioxide gas. So here we find in this study that even the natural processes can also release certain toxic elements which could be toxic for health, but in general there are several of the industrial processes which use nickel or copper or cadmium or chromium, and all these when dispersed into the environment, even for example the particulate matter containing compounds like the sulfur oxides or the sulfur dioxide, even that can also damage our lungs and then create a lot of health issues. Now, even the same environment factors, if they are healthy, then they can also promote healthier and longer lifestyles, longer health, and also productivity. So therefore, this association between environment and health, this is directly proportional, and the environmental health issues and the diseases, they may arise from the toxic elements in the water, in the air, and in the soil, and even on the rocks that we build our homes, because sometimes even the rocks can also emit certain toxic radiations, for example the radon gas, and that can also create certain problems for our health. Then in the same way, there are several other examples that which comes to my mind is that of the Sudbury smelter. And here we find that the nickel containing compounds were released, and that again created a lot of problem for the environment, for the health of the people. And in a small town, here we find that there were a lot of mines, there were a lot of smelters, there were a lot of refineries, and this nickel containing and other all these toxic compounds, they actually affected the air quality, the environmental quality. And then finally the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, they came up with certain guidelines and regulation, and then also in 1972 there was a draft guideline which also came up, and here they the smaller stacks were again, the taller stacks were made from the height of the stacks were increased, and then 50% of reduction of all these particulate matter and the emissions from the refineries were seen by the year 1972. But then we have observed, or the scientists observed, that there were decades of acid rain and acidification of the lakes which were observed over there. And once the Sudbury area had dense forestation, like dense vegetation, and the tree cover was also very good. But then after all this, there was a loss of biodiversity, decline in many of the plant and the animal species. So here again we find that the environmental activities, in this case it was the mines, it was the smelting and the refineries that have introduced these toxic elements into the atmosphere, into the environment, and deteriorated the air quality. Therefore, in this session, we need to understand certain important terms. Now, the term pollution, this and contamination, these are similar terms, and pollution is the undesirable effect of certain hazardous substances which are released into the environment. They can have toxic effects on people, on animals, on plants, on the ecosystems. Contamination again is a similar word to pollution, and for example, we use the term that a certain place is contaminated with toxic hazardous waste, or it is contaminated with electronic waste. Now, toxic refers to anything which is poisonous or which is toxic to human health. Toxicology is the science which studies the effects of the toxic compounds, and the dose and the concentration of the toxic compound is of interest. Synergism, this is a very important term. That means it is the interaction of two substances, that is of a chemical or of two or more chemical compounds. For example, if we take a single chemical, for example, it could be even an emission, it could be sulfur dioxides, or it could be the particulate matter in the case of air pollution. So now both of them independently, they can affect or they can exert the human health effects, and that can definitely harm the human beings. But when they act together, then that can exceed the sum of the individual effects, and that is what we refer to the term synergism. For example, if sulfur dioxide is deposited onto particulate matter or is adsorbed onto such particulate matter or particulates, then this particulate compound containing the sulfur oxides, that could be inhaled very easily. It could then get lodged into the bronchi, the bronchioles, and the lungs of a person, and it can even damage the lungs irreversibly. So that is the effect of synergism of a chemical or two or more chemical compounds. Now, how do we define toxicology, and what is the concept that is used in the ecotoxicology and the principles that we use in ecotoxicology? So there are mention of certain toxic substances by Hippocrates, by Aristotle and Theophrastus way back in 400 BC, and also in ecotoxicology and toxicological studies. The study of Paracelsus and Orfila are of utmost importance, and they are also referred to as the founders of modern toxicology. They introduced a very important term where the dose and the concentration of a chemical or of an element is very important. For example, a compound or a dose of a chemical that may not be toxic at a certain concentration, but when these substances are poison at a higher concentration. So all substances are poisons, but if we take that at a higher concentration, it could be even a medicine, it could be a pharmaceutical drug. So that may not exert toxicity at a certain level, for example aspirin, but when you take it at a higher concentration, at a dose which is not recommended safe, then even that can also become poisonous to human health. So it is a dose that makes a thing poison, or that which makes a chemical poisonous. Now, human behavior and pollution. So we are very much concerned about our behavior, our attitude towards the environment, and all this has resulted, that is the negative influences, if we detail, it has resulted in pollution, in smog, which is a combination of smoke and fog, in the acidification of the lakes, in the oceans. Then all these have serious consequences on all levels in the ecosystem. Because when we talk about ecotoxicology, we are not dealing only with the toxicity at the individual level, but we are dealing with the toxicity which is occurring at the ecosystem level, at the community level, and so on. Now, the nature of the pollutant, the characteristic of the pollutant, the phase association and the movement along which it moves. All these are very important in the biosphere, and they are also very important factors which are to be considered in the field and in the domain of ecotoxicology. So, how do we define the term ecotoxicology? So this, of course, it has several definitions, and if we also talk about the toxic effects on the ecosystems, so these toxic compounds, they can threaten the survival of certain ecosystems, and it can result in serious consequences and irreversible changes, as I told you in the examples given in the beginning of the session. Like you could observe the soil decline of the productivity in the soil, or the loss of biodiversity, the loss of soil cover, then decline of forests, there could be a loss of fish production, and all this can result in the decline and loss of the aesthetic, the functional and commercial value of certain ecosystems. Now, what about the toxic effects which are observed on the communities? So we can also find that even in the web chain and also in the food chains, we find that the toxic substances can eliminate a variety of species. It can promote the undesirable growth of certain weeds, for example, in a community. So this will actually disturb the food web dynamics, and the species interactions will then get affected. The nutrient dynamics can be disturbed and altered. Now, in this figure, you are actually seeing an orchard, that is an apple orchard or a farm. Imagine if this apple orchard or the farm is sprayed with a lot of the chemical pesticides, and along with the pest of interest, we are also destroying the predators, which are also very important in the food chain, in the web dynamics, and also in the ecosystem. So by spraying such unwanted chemicals, we are also destroying the useful things which are also doing some good to the ecosystems. Now, ecotoxicology was termed by quite a few scientists, and it was first defined by René Truhaut in 1969. And as from the term, we see that it comes from two words and two subjects, that is ecology as well as toxicology. Now, this aims to assess the impact of chemicals not only on the individual people or on individuals, but on the populations and also the whole ecosystems. So that is why it is very important to understand the toxicity risk assessment, the hazard assessments in a certain place. And even if anybody comes to know that some toxic thing has been applied to a farm or even to a road or even to a water in certain places, then immediately that water should be shut off for human consumption and also for other activities, so that the people and the living beings, the biota, are not affected due to these contaminants. Now, initially, the important tools of the environmental toxicology that were to actually detect certain toxic residues in the environment, in the individual organisms, and then also testing the toxicity of certain chemicals on the animals. So if you go to any testing laboratory, you will find that the mixture of the chemicals, even for example, any new chemical which is coming into the market, it could be a dye which is to be applied to the hair, or it could be any cosmetic product. So first there is something which is written on the label. If you flip the cover, you always see that this has been tested on animals, or it has been tested on a certain population of humans for quite a period of time, and they also observe the report that there is no adverse toxic reaction or effect which has been observed. But of course, certain people may be more sensitive than others, because our immunology, our toxic reactions in the body, our metabolisms are all different and hereditary in nature, and therefore, and also elderly and the infants, they may also be affected. They may have certain dermatitis, and these toxic response mechanisms may be different for certain people. Therefore, testing a toxic product is very important in the laboratory and also at the individual level. Now, we can also define ecotoxicology, which was given by Forbes and Forbes in the year 1994, where it is defined as a field of study which integrates the ecological and toxicological effects of chemical pollutants on populations, on communities and ecosystem, with the fate That means it includes the transport of the chemical, the biotransformation of the chemical, and the breakdown of certain pollutants in the environment. So this is a more comprehensive definition of the term, and we are able to understand the concept and also principle behind ecotoxicology more clearly and precisely from this definition given by Forbes and Forbes in the year 1994. Now, at an individual level, the toxicants can exert certain toxic effects either on the biochemical level or at the molecular or the physiological structure, and the function of the living tissues can also be damaged, and that can have serious consequences. Now here in this figure, you can find the figure of a DNA strand, which is a double helix model, and we also find the chromosomes. So certain chemicals can insert, it can affect certain insertions, it can affect certain deletions in arms of the chromosome, bringing about a change in the genetic material. So if a certain part of the genetic material is duplicated, or if it is deleted, or there are also certain inborn errors of metabolism, and a single gene codes for a single amino acid. This is a concept that we know. So there can be also certain coding errors in this basic functional and structural mechanism in the human body, and all this can be disturbed just because of human behavior, just because of introduction of certain toxic chemicals, hazardous chemicals, which can come from the biomedical waste, it can come from the electronic waste, it can come from the air pollutants, from the industrial processes, and also from the water processes, like where several of the hazardous chemicals are released. For example, the tanning industries, the textile industries, they all pollute the nearby lakes without the proper treatment technology being followed. So ultimately, we are getting affected, the living beings are affected, and certain diseases take a very long time to be manifested, and this is also known as, referred to as the chronic toxicity, where it takes several years. For example, in the case of arsenic toxicity, or also in the case of certain problems related to mercury toxicity and so on, which we will discuss shortly. Now, there are categories of pollutants. So we have the infectious agents or the biological agents which are causing toxicity, and then we also have certain industrial pollutants and the chemicals, and this can also involve organic compounds like the volatile organic compounds or the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, the PCBs, and also the heavy metals like mercury, lead, cadmium, nickel, gold, arsenic, selenium, then chromium, and also thallium. So all these are causing deleterious effects in the human beings. So what are the influences, or what are the factors which have influenced the development of this ecotoxicology globally? Now globally, if we see, the first thing that was noted was DDT, which was sprayed, and which is an organochlorine compound, and here this DDT had a lot of effects on the thinning of the bird shells, and also we find that there were a lot of problems with DDT, either as endocrine disruptors and cause certain cases also causing a lot of toxicity in the human health. And also we find the cadmium, which caused the Itai disease in Japan, also referred to as the ouch disease, mercury in Japan, then there were PCBs in Japan and Taiwan, then dioxins, we will discuss about this, and later on in 1960, when Rachel Carson came up with the book on Silent Spring, then people became more and more aware to these environmental toxins and how we need to be prepared for the same. Now, the first that we will discuss is the mercury toxicity. So in an area in Japan, certain industrial processes which came out from the Chiso Factory Corporation, they released mercury, methyl mercury, into the Shirauni Bay, into the Minamata Bay and the river, and the fishes were contaminated, and there were also the conversion of inorganic to organic methyl mercury by these fishes by the anaerobic methylation process. And when the human beings and the people they ingested and took these fish containing products like shellfish and all that, they were contaminated with this mercury. Then a strange disease was noticed, which was referred to as the Minamata disease, referred to the place. And this mercury toxicity, it caused paralysis of the limbs, loss in vision, and a lot of neurological behavioral problems, because mercury can also cross the blood-brain barrier and it can cause irreversible effects in the human beings. So here there were a lot of problems related to the mercury toxicity. Another important toxic study which is important and which was also a useful thing studied in the domain of ecotoxicology is that of the chromium toxicity. So chromium, many of you may be working in the laboratories, and even in the 10th and the 12th standard you would have conducted experiments. It is a yellow compound, and also potassium dichromate is found in the laboratories, which is slightly orangish in color. So this is used in the fertilizers, in the production of paints, in the electroplating industries, in tanning, in the paper and pulp. So it's used in several industries. And it causes a lot of problems like chlorosis or necrosis in the plants and toxic to the humans. Now Kanpur in India, this has a predominance of the leather industries. Around 400 or more of these leather industries are there, located on the banks of the river Ganga in the Jajmau area. And here we find that many of the water containing bodies and the groundwater is contaminated seriously with this chromium containing compounds. So now if we see certain reports from the newspapers and from the journals, it is quite shocking, and it is observed that the villages in Kanpur, they drink, when the water is coming out from the pumps, the hand water pump, they drink the neon green water and they live near a toxic waste dump. So obviously from the waste, this has trickled into the groundwater, and this in Khan Chandpur and the surrounding villages, they are contaminated with the carcinogenic heavy metal, where 45,000 tons of the toxic waste is dumped nearby. So in chromium, the trivalent chromium and hexavalent chromium states are observed, and we are more concerned about the hexavalent chromium, and the trivalent can be converted to hexavalent due to the conditions that are prevailing in the environment. It depends on the pH, on the alkalinity of the surrounding and so on. And so this hexavalent chromium is really toxic to health. It is carcinogenic, and that can cause a certain lot of problems with the health of the people. So here you find in this waste dump that the chrome sulfate is used in the chrome sulfate manufacturing industries, and that is used as a tanning agent for leather, and it is not toxic in itself, but the improperly treated waste is being dumped there, and that leads to the formation of hexavalent chromium, and that is actually giving rise to certain issues. Now in the same way, there is also cadmium toxicity. So cadmium is used in the manufacture of certain rechargeable batteries and in alloys, and this also enters the food chain through the industrial activities. Now there was an issue in Japan where the cadmium contaminated rice was found, and the itai disease, which I mentioned earlier, it was a painful disease of the bones, and the knees and the bones of the people were affected because it also causes bone mineralization. So cadmium, if you see even in the coal, there is only 0.05 ppm which is present. But this cadmium, when the coal is burnt, when that is burnt, then we find that it comes out as a ash which is found, and then this ash can be dumped in certain basins in the soil, and then that again can be revegetated with soil and so on. And then the scientists have observed that the cadmium can even then be accumulated in the plants and also in the soil. So that means the cadmium moves to the food chain. And then we have also seen that when it moves through the food chain, finally in the humans, this concentration increases by a factor of even 50 to 60 times. So then the cadmium toxicity can be even more. So now you will find the details and the root cause of how the cadmium entered the rice and how the humans were affected with this disease causing severe arthritis and bone beetling. Pesticides. Now this is also of serious concern, where in several places the pesticides have been sprayed with endosulfan. In Kasargod in Kerala, this was there, and many of the people were actually affected, and they suffered, and also the infants had born, they had congenital abnormalities, teratogenic effects. They are also referred to as the birth defects. So genetic abnormalities were seen in the children, and here you see that a farm which is sprayed entirely using certain toxic chemicals, and then people are also rallying and saying that we need to ban these harmful pesticides which are very harmful to human health and also to the ecosystems. So we need to know the source from where our food comes, the agricultural produce, because apples, if they are sprayed with pesticides, they can contain a very high concentration of these compounds. In the same way, certain other food products. So therefore, there are alternatives. Sustainable organic farming, sustainable alternatives are there for sustainable food production, and this is also very important, where we can check the control and the release of certain harmful toxic substances and dispersal of the same into the food chain and also into the environment. Organic compounds. Now in this, dioxin is a very important study, and this is a colorless crystal that is made up of oxygen, hydrogen, carbon and also chlorine. So around 75 types of this dioxin are known, and it is also coming from the byproducts from various industrial processes. Now we also find this dioxin in the Agent Orange, which was used in the Vietnam War, and that is a very toxic compound of this war, and this caused a very severe acne problem in the people who were affected with this compound. And again, dioxin itself it is persistent, it remains in the environment for a long period of time, it is not biodegradable, so this again can cause irreversible effects. A very important study that was observed in the Times Beach in Missouri. This was somewhere in the year 1983, and it is towards the west of St. Louis, and here we find that there was the population of only 2,400 people, and they were completely evacuated. So why they were evacuated? Because there was one land, and here again they contained certain industrial and the toxic chemicals, and here we find that the land was finally sold to a government, and after the purchase and the selling of the land to the government for almost 30 or 40 US dollars, then they found that this land and the area of the town was completely contaminated with the dioxin, because the town's road dust was sprayed using an oil which contained dioxin. So therefore, there were a lot of studies which came up. There was also the EPA which sat, and also the draft reports which came up, and then still decades or 20 years, I would say, of the controversy has occurred due to this dioxin and the health effects on the environment and on the human health. So there are several cases which have been reported. So the fate of the chemicals in the environment. So when any chemical comes into the environment, what will be the fate of that environment? What about the movement of the environment in the systems, and also at the organism level? And at the organism level, how these are being eliminated from the body, that is important. So there are certain biomarkers which are a chemical or chemicals that give a measure of the exposure and also of the toxic effect. They are classified as biomarkers of exposure and that of toxic effects. And then some examples of biomarkers, they range from the inhibition of acetylcholinesterase in the nervous system of the animals to the thinning of the bird shells in the eggshells in the birds, and then they can establish certain gaps between the lab and the field by giving direct evidence of whether a particular animal or a plant or an ecosystem is being affected by such kinds of pollution. Now, there are several toxicity tests which are conducted on several animals in the laboratory under controlled conditions, and this is also very important as they can provide useful information about the regulation and also registration of certain toxic chemicals. So these are some of the tests. For example, there could be bacterial test, then algal test, and also we can have tests which are conducted on the zebrafish embryos in the laboratory. Many of the environmental scientists are working on such toxicological studies, also on the earthworms, on the sediment dwelling organisms, and also on the freshwater and the marine fishes. Therefore, all this toxicity assessment test, they are used to make assessments of the hazard and also of the risk and the potential which can cause the harm and the probability that the harm will be caused for human health. So therefore, hazard is a product of exposure and toxicity, and any compound or a chemical with moderate toxicity but high exposure, that can cause more damage than a very toxic chemical with a very low exposure. So here again, this is explaining the concept of the dose concentration principle, which was explained by Paracelsus long ago. So my dear learners, today we discussed about ecotoxicology, some basic concepts and principles, and we explained this with the help of a lot of the reports and the observations that have been given by scientists and researchers right from the 1960s. And we also discussed about the toxicity test, which is also important for the regulation and registration of the chemicals that are being used for various purposes, including the industrial application. And I hope you've had a good understanding in this session. I thank you for your patient participation. Thank you.